Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Taslim here to talk to you today about self-compassion. Now, when we think about self-compassion, we might think about giving ourselves a break, not expecting the best of ourselves, perhaps being fluffy or too nice or too kind. Self-compassion is really doing for ourselves what we would do for others. So if we think about compassion, that's trying to feel for others, right? So thinking about any kind of experience that someone else is having and imagining putting ourselves in that situation, and the emotions that are evoked through that exercise are usually ones of compassion, right? It's feeling for someone else. Now, we might be quite well versed at doing this for other people, but when it comes to doing it for ourselves, for some reason we seem to shy away from this. We tend to think that while it's okay for others to have their shortcomings, we need to expect ourselves to be held to a higher standard. When we make mistakes, they are unacceptable. When we have personal flaws, we need to work extra hard to correct them because they too are unacceptable. But let's just take a step back and think about where that kind of expectation came from. We may have had parents, teachers, peers who had really high expectations of us. We perhaps have just always had high expectations of ourselves. Now, when our self-worth, when how we perceive our value is tied to our outcomes, our standards, perfection, that's when we start to get really injured when we're not holding ourselves up to that high standard and meeting it. The reality of the situation is none of us are perfect. None of us. Not me, not you, not any of your colleagues, not your partner, not your parents. Nobody. When we can remember that none of us are perfect, this gives us an opportunity to try to find some compassion for ourselves. It can be hard, especially when we're used to having really high expectations for ourselves, especially when we're used to judging and criticizing for every single thing we do wrong. But we can try it. Self-compassion is being kind and understanding towards yourself, especially in the face of personal failure. We can recognize that being imperfect, failing, and experiencing difficulties in life is inevitable. We all experience imperfection because we all are imperfect. We all fail at something sometimes, and we all experience difficulties. Now, when we're used to having really high expectations for ourselves, these kinds of experiences might make us feel like we've done something wrong, and maybe we have. Or maybe it was just the universe doing its thing, and so the outcomes that we were expecting didn't quite work out. So instead of approaching it with criticism and judgment and being really hard on ourselves, perhaps we can be gentle with ourselves when confronted with painful experiences, recognizing that this is just part of being human. Doesn't mean that we are exceptionally flawed, more flawed than anyone else. Rather, the experience of failure, the experience of difficulties are just part and parcel of being human. And so when it's hard for us and when we're feeling really disappointed with the outcome or hurt by an imperfection or a failing or a mistake, instead of making it worse by being hard on ourselves or criticizing, perhaps we can be gentle the way we would be gentle towards a loved one. We can also recognize that suffering and personal inadequacy is part of the shared human experience. Sometimes we can feel really alone and isolated in our personal failing. Perhaps we can feel like no one would understand or no one has failed as bad as we have. when we think this way, we're also less likely to share our isolation and share our failings with others because it comes with shame, fear of being criticized by others. But if we can remember that we are not alone in our suffering, this gives us the opportunity to remind ourselves that we are, again, just as flawed as anyone else. But it also gives us permission to connect with others, to share our experiences with others, and to be reminded that we are not alone. Even when we feel alone, even when we feel like we have done the worst possible thing, we are not alone, and we are not exceptionally flawed. It is part of the human experience. And lastly, we can try to experiment curiously with observing our negative emotions and thoughts, having an openness and clarity with them, having a mindful awareness of them, not letting them take over, not letting ourselves get stuck in the negative thoughts and the negative emotions, but rather just experience them, observe them, watching them even like clouds floating through the sky. Often when we experience personal failure or some sort of inadequacy, we tend to fixate on it. We tend to have a hyper awareness of it. It might be all we're able to think about for the rest of the day. But really, number one, whatever happened is over. There's little we can do to control it or go back in time to fix it. And when we're hyper aware of it, it affects our ability to concentrate on other things, which is likely to lead to more mistakes. It also affects our mood and energy levels, which affects our ability to connect with both ourselves and others. And it also gets in the way of us being able to take a step back, evaluate, and think about what we want to do next to address this mistake or personal failure. So I invite everyone, try to be a little bit more self-compassionate. Think about what you would say to a friend in that situation, and try to say the same thing to yourself. Try to think about what others would feel if they were in your situation. And as you probably experience some compassion for that person, try to meet yourself with that same compassion. Try to remember that we're just human, that we are flawed. And we are allowed to meet ourselves with kindness. We are allowed to be gentle with ourselves. And we are allowed to love ourselves, even when we make mistakes. For more information or to connect with a mental health provider, visit silmmentalhealth.com. Thank you.